Good morning. Welcome back to real life. Welcome back to life after spring break, guys. Hopefully you figured out at your tables who had the best spring break and who had nice resting time at home. Is that a way to say it? There's some tan faces out there. You didn't get to rest at home like I did, so you're probably sad. Big announcement, Veritas is getting legit. We have a podium. So I used it on Sunday, felt a little awkward. Ended up standing beside it the whole time. So we'll see if I can figure out how to work with this. But it's very exciting. So be anticipating great things, I guess, because we now have a podium. So guys, after today, only 2 more weeks. This is awesome. 10 weeks is good. I'm so encouraged by how many people have been able to stick with it and keep coming. And yeah, this is the longest study that we do throughout the year. So start thinking about how you can stay in the Word in 2 weeks. Don't wait till our last Tuesday is up. But if you haven't been listening to Jen's teachings, you could maybe think about planning those for the week after and kind of going back and doing a review. That's always worth your time. We have, if you're newer to Veritas and there's studies that you haven't done in the past, you can email me and I can email you a PDF of an old study that comes with teachings on our podcast or on YouTube. That's another idea. This might seem super disorganized, but if you didn't do the first half of Exodus, you could go back and do that as well. You could order the book on Lifeway or Amazon and do that. I don't know that this would be interesting, though. I don't think it would come with the teachings because I think this was the first study that came with that QR code. So you can buy them for $3 per teaching if that interests you or whatever. So there's a couple live teachings that we did a year ago, but we did more of the video. So the plan for the next 2 weeks, so I will teach today. We're going to use this timeline to talk about the priestly story. Next week, that's week 9, we're going to do the video teaching for next week, and then we'll come together and finish strong the week before Easter. And then it's Easter, so that's exciting. Only other business thing is to know that our summer study will start after Memorial Day and end before 4th of July. And that will be on Tuesday evenings, everyone together. I think we normally start at 6:30 or 7, and it's still light outside, and it's fun, and we all come together. I think we'll end up meeting in the auditorium. So it's got a little bit of a different feel, but I hope that you'll plan on joining us for that. And no childcare. No childcare for the summer. So if you have if you need to get out ahead of that because maybe you don't have a dad who can watch the kids at night, then maybe get on that as well. Okay, so today we are going to do our 3rd week of the tabernacle. We're calling it the priestly story, and what we're going to do, I attempted to make a worksheet thing that you'll see on your table. So your options are, guys, you could open up and take notes, if you're a note taker, in your workbook. Or you can write notes on the timeline, okay? So what we're going to do, I went ahead and essentially drew what you guys have on your worksheet, but at the very least, we're going to add some little annotations on this timeline, okay? So at the very least, you're going to want to have to add some things to this. So, hey, Alexis, would you close the door? I'm sorry to put you on the spot. Thanks. Alexa, shut my door. Just because we have a podium doesn't mean we have everything fancy like that. Calm down. Okay, so this week, guys, we were learning mostly about the priests and about the priest's clothing and about the priest's work, their consecration, how they became ordained. And then at the end of our week, we saw a little bit more on the Sabbath. So what we're going to talk about is the big story of the Bible, the priestly story that is found within Genesis to Revelation. So just like with any story, we need to say, when did this begin? When did the story begin? And this won't surprise you. We're going to go back to Genesis. So we're going to see how the priestly story began at creation. And there's a verse that I think we're actually pretty familiar with as we're going to ask this question. So what does the priest's clothing teach us? Why is this worth our time? And I think you're really going to enjoy seeing how it is. So if we're looking for priests, we're looking for their work, and we're looking for what they're wearing in creation, here's where we start. Do you guys remember the verse about Adam and Eve? They were naked and not ashamed. Pretty familiar verse, that they were naked and not ashamed. Why do we say that they were priests? It's not explicit, right? There's not a verse that explicitly says Adam and Eve were the first priests. But scholars all over the place will back up that they were fulfilling a priestly role. Think of their job. Their job was to serve in this temple. Eden was the first temple, the place where God dwelt. And so Adam and Eve had a job to do, to work the temple, to subdue, to have dominion, to be fruitful, to multiply, to be image bearers. We've talked about these things. But then we know the verse that they were naked and not ashamed. And I think that lots of times when we think of that verse, we think, oh, that's so cool. That's awesome. And because of sin, that's why we have shame. That's why we're not all naked all the time. And maybe we think of this verse and we think, that's why kids are okay being naked, because they don't understand shame, right? And that's not totally wrong. I think some houses with little kids have naked hour, naked parades I've heard about, right? And we just think it's so cute with their little tushes running around or whatever. But I actually want to put out there, guys, that maybe we have oversimplified our understanding of the verse, they were naked and not ashamed. Maybe we need to go back to that first audience. So who was Moses writing Genesis for originally? Because when it was read over them before they entered the promised land, that Adam and Eve were naked and not ashamed, they would have been like, wait, what? That seems a little weird. That doesn't really make sense. And here's why. They understood that Adam and Eve were priests. They understood that Adam and Eve were royal priests. And so they would be like, naked? That's not how a priest should be dressed. That's not distinguished. That's not royal. That's not communicating who they are. And so to them, they would maybe think, wait a minute. Adam and Eve were naked at the beginning, but maybe what we are to understand is that after they had served as priests for a while, after they had done their job with wisdom and discernment, then they would have been clothed as God's royal priest. They would see it as, this was going to change. With time, with maturity, they would have been clothed as priests. So let's start by first drawing. We want to add to our understanding that Adam and Eve were royal priests. So we're going to do your best crown above Adam and Eve. And if you want to, you could even draw some little gems on here, since we saw that in our homework this week. Everyone be confident. You got this. Draw a little crown up there. I saw some insecure faces. Adam and Eve were royal priests that were going to be clothed as priests, given time, given obedience as they served. Okay, but did they do a good job as priests? No. Instead of being faithful, instead of ruling and subduing, they rebelled. Adam and Eve were imperfect priests, and that's when we read about their nakedness becoming a problem, right? They rejected God as king, they rivaled his throne, and then what happens, guys? They notice that they are naked, and they're embarrassed, they're ashamed. And so what do, guys? You know this. What's their first thing that they do when they realize that they're naked? They take fig leaves. They say, okay, I'll just make a covering by myself. And what they're doing with those fig leaves is that they are hiding both from God and from each other. And God finds them. He gives them an opportunity to confess, to draw them out, but he finds them hiding. And there's this beautiful verse in Genesis chapter 3 that deserves our attention. After God has found them and given them a chance to confess and Everyone's blaming everyone else. He goes into the consequences of the fall. He goes into the curse of the fall. But then in Genesis 3:21, it says, the Lord God made clothing. The Lord God made clothing from skins for the man and his wife, and he clothed them. Guys, this is where we need to realize that this priesthood, this royal priesthood, there's also blood there. So draw a couple drips of blood down here. At the fall, Adam and Eve, our first priests, have shown their imperfections. They have failed. And so early on in the Bible, we see God intervening by sacrificing an innocent animal. Sin has now caused a sacrifice to be needed. Nakedness is covered through the death of another. Okay, let's move along our timeline. So if the story of priesthood has already started, then it makes sense why in Exodus there was a lot of pages given to the priests and to their clothing. And so we read about ephods, breastpieces, robes, turbans, coats, and sashes. We read that they were supposed to be clothed in holy clothing, and the purpose was for glory and beauty. So guys, we've got to actually be picturing this. These items of clothing made them beautiful. And it was so fun to realize when we looked at the descriptions of the clothing that they were like matching the inside of the tabernacle. And my first answer was pretty shallow. Gosh, I hope that's not the word. Simple. I thought it was so cool. I pictured them and how with the white linen and the matching embroidery and the jewels, how they would have matched. And I pictured like how they could like press up against the temple and just pretty much hide, right? Like if I don't want to work anymore, they could just like stand there against the inside of the tabernacle and nobody would see them. There's a little bit more of an answer than that of why would God have them look like the temple, the tabernacle? Well, think how cool it would have been if you were an Israelite woman and you're living in that camp and you see one of the priests fully clothed walking around camp. Do you think you would just shrug and not even notice it? Or do you think that whatever you had been talking about, you would have stopped talking, right? You would have stopped and gone, oh, whoa. And whoever you were talking to, wouldn't you have gone, look at him? I mean, it would be quite literally breathtaking, right? There would have been a hush, there would have been a calm, and then there would have been a buzz. As you said, look at that robe. Oh my goodness, look at those jewels. Look at that turban. Look how high it goes. It looks like a crown, right? It would have been awesome. It would have been stunning. You would have immediately responded with respect. Guys, I think that we understand this because we've all been to weddings. I think it's similar to that, right? Like whatever is going on, whatever you're thinking about as the wedding begins, the second that bride starts walking down the aisle, you stop thinking about that, right? And you just take in her splendor and her beauty, and you're looking at the details of her outfit, right? I think it was the same with the priests, and we need to understand that. So when they would walk through the tent, as they didn't just stay in the tent or the tabernacle, but they'd walk around camp, you would see them as royal. You wouldn't just see them as like how we see a pastor. You would see them as much more than that when they were in their full garb. Just as God said at the very beginning of our study that these people would be a royal priesthood, he is now showing that Aaron and his family, the Levites more specifically, were going to be royal. But what was their job? Okay, are you picturing them in their outfit? The white, fresh linen, this beautiful flowing, we're talking long sleeves, full length tunic, robe. To say they're in their Sunday best is an understatement. Yet, what was their work? They sacrificed animals for the forgiveness of sins for the people. Their work was killing animals and spilling blood. Let's not move past this. It's weird. It's weird to think, it's shocking to think of somebody dressed like that standing at the altar that we looked at last week and spilling blood. And we had to go into the details of that in our homework. It's not just a quick little spilling of blood. It's not just every now and then. This was all the time, their full-time job. Spilling the blood, dealing with carcasses, dealing with body parts and entrails, and cutting these animals apart. Guys, our stomachs should turn. We should see this as quite the contrast between what they were dressed like and what their work was, right? We understand that these don't go together. It doesn't make sense. But here next to this royal clothing, we need to remember that blood was very present in their job. How long do you think those clothes stayed white? How in the world did they clean clothes back then? Isn't it odd? Let's not push past kind of this contrast and this tension that people dressed like this. The last thing that they would want to be doing was sacrificing animals. It's gross. It's exhausting. Expensive. Guys, the smells, the noises, it doesn't fit what you would see when you looked at the priests. It seems like a contradiction. And so we looked, just like many times this week, we looked at how the Old Testament is pointing forward. What I want you guys to see just for now is, yes, we saw in our homework how this priesthood was pointing forward to Christ. But we even get to come further back, and we get to see how, even all the way back in Eden, when we read about priest, it's a whisper, it's a hint, it's telling us, get excited for a much better priest to come. But we can even see it now in the fall. We see an arrow pointing forward when we saw an animal that spilled its blood for the covering of sin. And so it's not like this is a surprise. You guys know that in the priestly story, the high point is that Jesus shows up as the great high priest. He shows up, and we get to see him. We saw it in our homework, that Jesus fulfilled these earlier references of the priesthood. So let's ask our two questions. What did Jesus wear? And if you think about it, the very first time we read about Jesus' clothing, this is the one from Matthew. This is an announcement given from angels to shepherds. Today in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you. He is the Messiah, the Lord. This will be a sign to you. You will find a baby wrapped in swaddling cloths and lying in a manger. Okay, do you see actually how our two drawings make sense here? Where was he to be born? In the city of David. So right away, that original audience is hearing royal undertones. But he's going to be clothed in what? Oh my goodness, he's going to be royal. Here comes the king. Here comes the long-awaited king. He's going to be wrapped in swaddling cloths. Don't overthink it, guys. Just boring, normal cloths. This is what every baby in Bethlehem would have been wrapped in. This is what every baby in the Middle East would have been wrapped in. It's a little underwhelming, but maybe that's part of the meaning. This royal city of David is welcoming their king, and he is going to be, in so many ways, just like everyone else. He is going to need his arms and his legs held down so that he can feel safe, so that he can sleep, wrapped in swaddling cloths. And I've never really thought much about it, but why? What are we seeing in our great high priest's clothing right there? We're actually seeing the truth of Philippians 2 that Paul would talk about so much longer after this, when he says that, speaking of Jesus, although he was in the form of God, he didn't count equality with God as something to be grasped. He emptied himself. So let's make sure we understand what this means in light of our story today. When we read that Jesus emptied himself, guys, that does not mean that his divinity was subtracted. It means that his humanity was added. It's very important for us to understand that as we study Christ. When we read that he emptied himself and that he became a man, it does not mean that he became less God. His divinity was not subtracted at any point, but he emptied himself through addition, the addition of human flesh and weakness. He was one of them. He was one of us, just like Aaron. and his sons were just like everyone else. Jesus wasn't breathtaking. Jesus wasn't apparently royal. He wasn't stunning. When he walked through the crowds, when he tabernacled among the people, people weren't immediately like, oh my goodness, he's beautiful. Oh, I want to follow him because of the mystery of his clothing. It wasn't apparent to the blind eye that he was royal or that he was a priest even. But much like the priest in Moses' day, guys, he didn't stay up in a high and lofty tower, maybe like a king normally would, but he came down, and like the priests moved around the camp, Jesus came and he tabernacled, like moved around, a living temple, moving around, interacting with the people. And often his priestly role was just maybe hinted at during his ministry. Think of a story when someone comes to him for forgiveness, or someone comes to him for healing, but instead he would offer forgiveness. Multiple times he would do that. Guys, every time you see in your Bible reading that Jesus offers forgiveness to an individual, you should be cued that he's revealing who he is as the great high priest. And every time you see Jesus do something for an individual in the New Testament, he's showing you what he's going to do on a cosmic scale. When he forgave the woman who was caught in adultery, who was about to be stoned, he is showing the readers, he is showing us what he was going to do on a much bigger scale. Every healing that you would see Jesus do, healing a blind man, healing a leper, healing a paralytic, it's just a little appetizer. It's just a little taste of what he's going to do on a much bigger, on a cosmic scale. The Son of God became a human tabernacle. He became a royal temple, and he lived and he moved among them. But it would take the eyes of faith for people to see him for who he was. Right? He would just look like an ordinary person. It didn't take the eyes of faith in the Old Testament to believe that that priest was special or important. But in Jesus' day, it couldn't be seen without faith because he wasn't dressed in crisp white linens. He wasn't wearing a turban on top of his head like a crown. But there is one time, and I'm very thankful for this story. This took me a while, but when the Lord showed me this scripture, I was like, oh, that helps me understand. Here's where the Bible teaches the Bible. There is one time where Jesus kind of let a couple disciples look behind the curtain to see him as the great high priest. There was one time that he showed his glory during his earthly ministry where he made it pretty explicit, and it was just to 3 people. I'm giving you a second to think in your head so that you can enjoy this moment. There is one moment where Jesus is going to show his authority. He's going to show his splendor, his majesty. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. Exodus, right? Yeah. There he was transfigured before them. Here's the description. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. And just then, there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. This is super weird. I don't know what. I would have responded a lot like Peter, actually. So what does Peter do? He gets an idea, always. Nervous energy Peter always has an idea. He goes, Lord, it is good for us to be here. And I'm thinking Jesus is like, yeah, I know. He says, if you wish, I will put up 3 shelters. One for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. Guys, what is Peter thinking about right here? He sees glory. He sees splendor. And he is a Jew. What does he know? That glory belongs in a temple. That glory can't be out here. This isn't okay. That glory, it belongs in the tabernacle. And so he says, I'll build 3, let me just whip up 3 tents for this glory to be enclosed. That's where it belongs. So he shares his idea, and while he was still speaking, best interruption of all time, a bright cloud, there's Sinai again, covers them. A voice from the cloud says, This is my son. Kidding. Whom I love, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. As if Jesus' authority wasn't clear enough in that moment, God comes in with a voice of authority. This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him. When the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. Get up, he said. Don't be afraid. When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. Oh man, guys, if we couldn't imagine what it would be like to be in that ancient camp of Israel when the priest walked through, when we would stop our conversation and we would point and we would gawk at how beautiful their clothing was. Can we imagine being here in this moment? I hope we would have nothing to say and that we would fall down in the most healthy terror of our life as we saw the most breathtaking view, beauty and splendor, majesty beyond what words could describe. And yet, what happens after that? Jesus comes down the mountain. We hear Moses going up, down, up, down. Jesus, God incarnate, comes down that mountain and resumes his journey to the cross. But he didn't have to take a stop to be ordained. They didn't have to build into the schedule a time for Jesus to be consecrated because this priest, unlike his predecessors, was not imperfect. He had no sin. He was sinless. In his ministry on earth, he obeyed the will of the Father perfectly. And the pinnacle of his obedience was the cross. So let's imagine that scene at the cross. Guys, if our stomachs turned and if we were confused at the scene of those beautiful priests in white linen, touching blood, spilling blood, working with death, if we were confused and horrified by that, then what are we seeing at the cross, guys? A scene much more offensive. Nothing. This held nothing to the priests of Moses' days in their tunics and robes, because this priest was perfectly holy. He didn't need clothing to communicate that he was different. He in his very nature was completely pure. And guys, it wasn't the blood of bulls and rams and lambs that this priest was up to his elbows in. It was his own blood that was spilled in that moment. And it wasn't a turban that crowned his head, indicating that he was king, but it was a crown of thorns that with great irony crowned him as the King of the Jews, as the plaque above his head communicated. Guys, here we see once again a radiant, glorious priest, the very manifestation of God's glory, again, marred and covered in blood. And in his death, he provides for us the clothing that we need. Because as we studied this week, we saw that because Jesus tabernacled among his people, because Jesus served as a great high priest, and because Jesus served as the sacrificial lamb, all three themes converging together, because he died, and then he was resurrected, and then he ascended, he then shares his identity with his children. And if we were confused before, we should be confused all the more now. We now share in his identity as a royal priest. He, in his death, as his flesh was torn, how about while he was stripped of all his clothing, our clothing was provided. We were told in our homework, we discovered through God's word that we were given a robe of righteousness. That was his robe that he was stripped of, that is then put on us. We are the royal priesthood, guys. And so our question then is, how are we to be clothed? Here's an easy question for the morning, is it our physical clothing that should stop people in their tracks and make them wonder about us? Is it what we look like that should create a buzz in a room or in a neighborhood or in a church foyer? No. Paul gives us a nice, explicit answer. What is it, if it's not our actual physical appearance, that should communicate to people what God is like, that should clue people in that we are going to God on their behalf? It is our behavior. Paul explains in Colossians, he tells us, put off your old self and instead put on your new self. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourself with, here comes a good list for us, guys, compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Should I keep going? More options for us, guys? We want to look like a priest? Then let's do this. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues, put on, there's our clothing language still. What are we supposed to put on? Love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. This is now our clothing while we wait for our resurrected bodies. This is our clothing while we wait for our blood-stained, washed linens to be given to us in the new heavens and the new earth. We put on compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. How are we doing with that, guys? Can we take a second? Is this what we're wearing? How are we doing with bearing with one another? How are we doing with forgiving people? Ladies, when we walk around our weeks, much like the priest would walk around the camp, if we can put on these things, it will stop people in their tracks and it will make them curious about the things of God. It will whet their appetites for the glory of God. They might say, wait, maybe that's a little bit what God is like. So it's what we wear, and it's how we do our work. It's how we care for people. It's how we carry their burdens. So could we get even more specific here? I believe that you guys care for people all week. I believe that you're carrying each other's burdens all the times, but I think that there's even more wisdom that would be good for us to talk with each other about how to actually do that. What if we started, if we're going to care for someone, if we're going to bear with their burdens, what if we really, really believed that the most effective thing we could do is prayer? Not fake like we mean it, guys. What if we really, really believed that prayer, oh man, so there's a quote. I'm not going to be able to tell you who it was. That prayer, it's coming. Prayer does not prepare us for the greater work. Prayer is the greater work. Anyone know who said that? Okay. Prayer does not prepare us for the greater work. Prayer is the greater work. So what if we saw that that was the most important way, the most effective way that we could love each other well and bear each other's burdens? In this room, in our families, in our extended family, to our neighbors. And then, okay, we prayed, so then what if we even stopped and did one more step before we give them all this great advice? What if we listened? What if we upped our listening game? And by doing so, we are acknowledging that we are not their Messiah, that we are not there to fix their problems. And then after we have listened, what if when we did open our mouths, we gave them the gospel? More than advice, what if we fed each other the gospel, the good news about what Jesus, as the great high priest, did for them, what he had ordained from before creation? Would we actually find that if we did these three things, we would stay out of the ditch of trying to fix the people around us? Would we actually find that we have more patience and more faith and more hope for the people in our lives? I love that as we moved into like the church age or new creation, guys, and we saw this in our homework, there's not blood that still has to be spilt here. But we are royal. We are a royal priesthood, as we see in 2 Peter 1:9. But guys, it's a royalty that doesn't make us act like we're a diva princess. Different kind of royalty. It doesn't mean we walk into a room and expect everyone to flock to us. It's a royalty that gives us a mindset for the future. It's a royalty that says, I can do hard things. I can endure. I can bear. I can hope. I can be compassionate and kind because I know that my future is secure. And there's not blood, but there is hard work, the hard work of bearing with one another. And my question as we end, guys, is what is at risk? What is at risk if we don't believe this about ourselves? What's at risk if we don't know the story or if we don't believe that we are a royal priesthood, that is our identity? Both in value, comfort, purpose. What's at risk? How might you behave if you don't actually believe this or if you're not feeling it? I think a lot is at risk. Because I thought of the story of the prodigal son. That is a more familiar story to many of us about this son who I think got confused or forgetful about who he was as a son. And so he asked for his inheritance early, and he takes off, he leaves home, and he lives what he thinks is the good life. He parties hard, he spends all of his inheritance, and it gets so bad. His life gets so dark that he's envying the pigs. He wants to eat the pigs' food because he is hungry, and he is alone, and he is far from home, and he thinks, well, it's better to go back and be a slave in my father's house than to be here. And so he comes with this plan that he'll go back and he'll work as a slave for his father. And we know where this goes. While the son is still far off, the son who has forgotten who he is on his way home. While he's still on the road, his father sees him and runs and meets him, welcomes him home. But it's in the details that we see the priestly story. His father gives him a robe, as if to say, oh no, you are coming back as royalty. You're coming back distinguished. He gives him a ring, like a signet ring, meaning you have a job. I am sharing my business with you. You will have authority to rule, to serve, to work. Sounds a little bit like Eden, right? And he gives him shoes. He gives him shoes as if to say, you're not coming back as a slave. Only slaves were barefoot. But shoes showed that he would come back as a son. What the father, who signifies God in the story, is doing at the time is reteaching him, reminding him of who he is. And it's beautiful because it's Jesus who's sharing this parable before the cross. It's Jesus, the great high priest, who is got this beautiful secret that he's going to, through his death, allow all of his believers, all of his children, to share in his identity as a priest. But guys, we have to know that. We have to believe that that's who we are. Because what's at risk is holiness. If we don't believe this, then we will wander off, looking for the good life. We will leave the nearness of the Father and try to find the abundant life in our own way. I love that this story shows us both Christ's once and for all work. I'm repeating this on purpose. We've done this 3 weeks now. Christ, as the priest, did a once and for all work when he died on the cross. But then he has an ongoing work as a great high priest as well, to intercede for us, to bring our names before the Father. like the priests quite literally brought the names of the Israelites that were etched into those stones before the throne room of God, Christ has a continual work as our intercessor. Listen to these lyrics. Before the throne of God above, I have a strong and perfect plea. A great high priest whose name is love, whoever lives and pleads for me. My name is graven on his hands. My name is written on his heart. I know that while in heaven he stands, no tongue can bid me thence depart. Let's let that just be our prayer as we end. What good news there is for us in those lyrics, guys. No tongue can bid us thence depart. He's got a hold of us, whether our grip feels strong on him or not. And he is sharing with us his victory. He is sharing with us the purpose as priests, so let's live it out. All right, we're going to go to our tables. And you're either going through your application questions, go through questions you had in your homework, or talk through this priestly story for the next 25 minutes. So please take your time, hunker down, and encourage one another well.